Courage to Heal. Chapter 1. The case before him looked hopeless. The spine was broken in several places. Threads of nerves lay unbound and exposed on the table. The pulp of innards crumbled in his fingers as he probed the grooves of the back. To the untried hand, the book would not make it. Luckily, Vincent Klause's hands were not untried. He'd seen worse cases. There had been that time when he'd been called on to restore a French encyclopedia from the 18th century, or the time he had revitalized a rare copy of the Roman Naturalis Historiae. With a steady hand and a reserve of patience, Vincent would have the priceless memoir, The Life and Speeches of Alexis Morris, back together in working condition. The man's heirs were counting on it. It was all they had left of the family patriarch, aside from a sizable inheritance that had grown in the 200 years since his death. Vincent picked up the tiny razor blade. He aimed the sharp edge at the aged pages that were stuck together. He had to be careful and sure, lest he nick an edge of a single sheet and leave behind a permanent dog-ear. He shuddered at the thought. It was the reason he avoided coffee shops. He'd witnessed one too many caffeinated drinkers assaulting the top corner of the page. Vincent took a deep breath, partly to clear the abominable thoughts, largely to ready his mind for the work ahead. With a surgeon's calm, he aimed for the edge of the page and— thud, thud, thud. A loud knock sounded at the door to his workshop. Vincent cursed as the blade sliced through his thumb. He yanked his hand away from the ancient book just before the red bead of blood could spill onto the aged parchment. He tossed the bloodied blade in the garbage. One-handed, he covered the pieces of the aged work, tucking it under the protective covering, like a father would swaddle his child in for the night. Once his work was safe, he stormed to the door of his workshop. On his way, he stepped over colorful Christmas lights and ornaments, a half-assembled rocking horse, a collection of foam reindeer antlers, and stacked wrapping paper and bows. His heavy boots thudded on the floor as he made his way through his small workshop. The room was airtight to keep out the elements. A book's greatest enemy was air. Its second greatest enemy were people who wanted to handle it with their grubby, unclean, sweaty hands. Vincent swung open the door. Not entirely open, just enough to peer out. He stood in profile, only showing his right side. Keeping the left side of his face in shadow was his habit. On the stoop stood a tall, thin man. The man wore a genial smile. Vincent had known Colton Evans since he was 8 years old enough to climb a tree with a book in his hand to settle down for the day and read. Now, 20 years later, Vincent towered over the older man. "Just wanted to say my goodbyes before I head out," said Evans. That wasn't necessary, but Vincent had been raised with manners. He forced a smile, remembered to nod in acknowledgement, and then pushed the door shut. The door's jamb did not engage. Evans had placed his hand in the way. His smile widened, but the corners of his eyes pinched inward. Vincent knew that look from when he was a boy. His uncle would give him the same look. The words that followed that look were always, "Put the book down, Vincent, and engage with the real world a while." Vincent took a deep breath, calling forth the patience he used to sew crumbling pages of ancient manuscripts back together. Papers he could thread. Weaving in and amongst people, that was another matter. Even before the accident, he'd never been good coming into the fold with those around. He was always out of the loop because he simply didn't mesh well with others. "Just wanted to let you know everything is put away, and the last of the workers are gone," said Evans. "The fields are ready for—" Vincent watched the man choke on whatever he was about to say. He knew Evans didn't agree with his decision. He knew no one from the town agreed with the sale of the farm, but it was the logical thing to do. "The fields are ready for you to do with them as you see fit," Evans finished. "Good." Vincent had never been one to mince words. He'd always preferred to read than to speak, and he already knew all of this. It was what he'd ordered the tree farm's workers to do. As a man who'd attained the rank of major in the U.S. Army, he expected his orders to be carried out without question. He preferred his army life to civilian life. There had been order in the ranks, rules to be followed. He would miss those days, but he couldn't go back, not after the explosion that had ended his military career. When he'd been discharged, he'd come home. He hadn't come to the doorstep upon which he stood now. On the other side of town was a rehabilitation ranch for soldiers. Vincent had spent 3 months at the Purple Heart Ranch recovering from his wounds. The doctors there thought he could have done with another month of convalescence, but there had been a catch. The land upon which the ranch rested had a confounding regulation attached to it. It was zoned for families, which meant that anyone residing on the ranch for more than 3 months would have to have a family. In layman's terms, that meant marriage, something Vincent never planned to do. So he'd hightailed it off the ranch and come home to his family's Christmas tree farm. "This year's crops of firs was a good one," Evans was saying. "You sure you don't want to cut down just a few to sell in town?" Vincent had already discussed this with his uncle, the only one whose opinion actually mattered. Vincent did not like repeating himself, and so he didn't. Instead, he leveled Evans with a stern glare. It was only a one-eyed glare, but it did the trick. Even though the man was older, Vincent was still the boss, or at least he had been for about a month when the farm's ownership had been transferred to him. When Uncle Nick had signed over the tree farm to Vincent, it had come with free rein to do whatever Vincent thought was best. Vincent had taken one look at the business's books and made his decision. The farm only made money 1 month out of the year, December. After that, the income tapped out. "I know your mind is made up about selling this place to the paper mill," said Evans. It was. The pulp from the trees would provide a constant income throughout the year. The farm would turn an actual profit, one substantial enough to allow Vincent to live quietly and fulfill his passion for restoring old books. "That's not why I came," said Evans. "I know your uncle's headed out of town. You shouldn't be alone for Christmas. I want you to know you're welcome in the Evanses' household." Vincent hadn't celebrated Christmas since he was a kid. It was a child's holiday, not a grown man's. Unfortunately, there was the pesky protocol of manners again. "Thank you for all of your work, Evans. I hope the severance package I provided was adequate." "It was more than generous." "Okay, then." The 2 men stood in the doorway. Both looked expectantly. Too bad for Evans that Vincent preferred the silence. Finally, Evans stepped down the stoop. "Offer's still on for you to come and spend the holidays with my family." "Thank you," Vincent said. "But I have a lot of work to do. Drive safe. Looks like a storm's coming." There. He'd shown manners, patience, and even consideration. He was done peopling for the rest of the day. Hopefully the rest of the month. Vincent turned back to the workshop. Inside looked like his own piece of heaven, minus the leftovers from his uncle's hobby of making toys for kids. Vincent would be clearing that out soon enough. As he headed back to his work table, he passed a mirror. He'd studiously avoided his reflection for the past year, so when he came face to face with his image, he was caught off guard. The left side of his face came into sharp focus. The scar from the explosion was there, beneath the beard the men in his family never had any problems growing. The black hairs covered most of the monstrosity, but Vincent saw the raised, angry flesh where the doctors had sewn him back together, as if anyone would want to spend the holidays with such a beast. He tossed a cloth over the mirror, then he picked up his tools and began gutting the book. Chapter 2. There was nothing like driving up on the familiar setting of home. Isabella Snow wiggled in the driver's seat as she took the turn off the highway. She could see the back of the town's clock tower from the exit. She knew that when she came down Main Street, She'd see the jagged burn mark from where lightning had struck the tower, the tallest building in town, 25 years ago, on the night she was born. Izzy knew that at the edge of the street would be her favorite store where Mr. Jenkins got up at 4 a.m, every morning except Sundays, to make donuts and bread. In anticipation, she wound the car window down to get a whiff. As she turned onto Main Street, the air that smacked her in the face was clear of buttery bread. She looked at the dashboard on her rental car. It was nearing noon. Maybe he was sold out? She looked up at the clock tower and saw nothing but new laid red brick. The jagged mark was gone. It had a new face. Had the townsfolk repaired it in the 2 years she'd been away? There were other changes. Mrs. Crawley's doll shop was now a Starbucks. Mr. Walsh's bookstore was now a Mexican restaurant. Up ahead, she saw why there was no buttery bread scent in the air. Mr. Jenkins' bakery was now a beer garden. What in the world? Had things changed so much here since she'd been gone? She hadn't lived here as a child, but her dad always brought his family to visit his sister for the winter holidays. With their visits commencing solely on the winter holidays, Izzy had always thought of the town as a Christmas town. But the plastic Christmas tree in the town square, the department store's cardboard cutout displays, and the decisive lack of ugly sweaters in store windows proved her childish imaginings wrong. The town had grown up and seemed to no longer believe in Christmas. It was a bummer. But she knew one place where she would find the holiday spirit. Izzy pulled up to her Aunt Beatrice's house. There were the same red shutters on the white house. There was the same flower bed, though it was covered with snow. There was the tree she used to climb, and the limb where she used to read her Sweet Valley High books. Home, sweet home. Izzy needed to surround herself with something familiar now that she was in between jobs. She'd been so caught up in her fast-paced world of digital books that she hadn't made it home for the last couple of years. She had some downtime as she waited to hear back from a potential employer. She was using the time off to come back to the one place she'd always called home. Izzy parked in the drive. There was another truck there. The red truck looked familiar. She was sure she'd seen the flatbed around town before. No, not around town. At her second favorite place in the world. Her heart swelled as the Christmas spirit took over. That was Mr. Klause's truck. He owned the Christmas tree farm where they'd always go and chop down their own tree every year. Was that why Mr. Klause was here? Was he making a home delivery of Aunt Bee's tree? Izzy was a touch disappointed that she wouldn't get to chop the tree down herself, but she'd be making up for it, spending the time decorating it with her aunt. Izzy hopped out of the car and made a dash for the front door. She didn't bother to knock. This had been her home when she was young. She burst through the front door and saw her auntie kissing Santa Claus. Aunt Bee and Mr. Claus stood by the fireplace. His arms were locked around Aunt Bee. His lips were locked on her, too. Aside from the fact that it was his truck parked in the drive, Izzy knew it was Nick Claus because he wore an ugly sweater, beet red with a white collar and an assortment of reindeer heads. There was also his trademark white curly hair and his fluffy beard he let her scratch when she was just a girl. Aunt Bee was fluffing Mr. Claus's beard with both her hands. Hello?" called Izzy. The two didn't have the decency to spring apart. They simply turned their heads to meet her gaze. Then they both broke out into welcoming smiles that held no hint of embarrassment. Nope, no awkwardness at all. All the red was on Izzy's cheeks. "Izzy, darling, what are you doing here?" Aunt Bee left Mr. Claus's embrace and came over to Izzy. "Didn't you get my message?" Izzy asked from inside her aunt's embrace. She smelled of pine needles, Izzy's favorite scent. "I have time off since I'm waiting to hear back on the new job with Rainforest Books." "Oh, sweetie." Aunt Bee pulled away. Instead of the expected happiness that her niece could spend the holidays with her, Aunt Bee looked concerned. "I didn't realize you were going to make it this year. I made other plans." "Other plans?" Izzy looked to Mr. Klause, who leaned casually against the fireplace, like he belonged there. "You remember Nick," said Aunt Bee. "Of course I do." Mr. Klause left the fireplace and joined the two women. At first, Izzy held open her arms. She was from a family of huggers. But then she dropped her arms. It had been years since she'd seen the man, and she had just caught him kissing her aunt. What exactly was the protocol here? She certainly wasn't laughing like the song about Mommy kissing Santa suggested. Mr. Klause solved the conundrum for her. He enveloped her in what was truly a bear hug. The man was large. Izzy had always thought he was the real Santa Claus, especially since he owned the town's Christmas tree farm, and he had a white beard. Nick Claus wasn't obese like the jolly old saint. He was fit. He had to be since he spent a good portion of his time chopping down fir trees. "So good to see you again, Isabella. I'm sorry I'll be stealing your aunt away for the holidays." "Stealing her away?" asked Izzy. "Nick has invited me on a holiday cruise." Aunt Bee actually bounced on her toes like a young girl. "A cruise?" said Izzy. "During Christmas?" "Well, no, not Christmas. I'll be back on the 24th. Are you able to stay that long?" "Yes," said Izzy. "Maybe, I guess so. Even if I get the job, it won't start until the new year." "Well, then that's perfect," said Aunt Bee. "You can stay here and rest. I'll see you when I get back." Izzy's mind was whirling. She'd spent one too many holidays alone since her father had passed. She really wanted to be around family for this one. But she didn't want to begrudge her aunt her happiness, and she sure looked happy under Mr. Claus's arm. Izzy looked over to the corner where her aunt usually put up the tree. "You didn't get a tree yet? I mean, when I saw Mr. Claus's truck, that's why I thought you were here." "I'm retired," said Mr. Klause. "My nephew took over the business. You met Vincent a couple of times when you were younger." Vincent Klause? Izzy vaguely remembered the boy. He'd always had his nose in a book. "You can go to the farm and grab a tree from him on the house. My treat for taking your aunt away from you. Take any one you like." That was a balm, at least. Picking out a live Christmas tree and chopping it down herself had always been her favorite part of the holiday season. Chapter 3. The silence was absolute. Not even the wind disturbed him. All Vincent heard was the rustling of pages as he meticulously pasted them back together. The clients for this book had been hesitant to let it out of their sights. After seeing Vincent's work, the offspring of Alexis Morris finally relented. The precious book couldn't have landed in better hands. Vincent was one of the best in his field of bookbinding. His specialty was antique manuscript restoration. The majority of his clients were families who had an old Bible to repair. That was his bread and butter. He could recite the books of the Bible in order by memory, likely more than most people who went to church on Sunday. His fingers itched any time he got something old and rare. It was the reason he'd been scarred back in the war. Instead of looking out for IEDs, his eyes had been on an ancient parchment he'd found in a crumbling temple. He'd awoken 3 days later in a military hospital, mourning the loss of the book more than the damage done to his face. Vincent was lucky the explosion in Afghanistan had taken the pound of flesh from his face and not his hands. He was even luckier that the shrapnel had missed his left eye only by a fraction of an inch. Life wouldn't have been worth living if he could no longer read. Even before he joined the armed forces, Vincent had craved the escape he found in books. He'd traveled to the far reaches of the world in his military career. He'd seen some of the world's most fascinating sights. He'd heard told some of the most exciting tales. Still, it all paled in comparison to what his mind could conjure at the turn of a page. His passion for, some would say obsession with, the written word had afforded him a vast library of his own. While he'd been deployed, he'd kept his hardbacks in an airtight storage facility. Now that he'd been medically discharged due to his wounds, he and his books had set up residence in his uncle's cabin in the woods. Now, he supposed, it was his cabin in the woods. For many people, home was where the heart was. For Vincent, home was wherever his books were. And now the old cabin would be his home. Vincent pressed the pages of the memoir together. 1 chapter done. 20 more to go. But that was enough work on his pet project for today. Time to go inside and curl up with a good book. Thwack! 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 Vincent had pretty much grown up on this tree farm. He could tell the difference between a dog's trot and a deer's gallop just by the sound. He could easily distinguish between a robin's call and a sparrow's, but he couldn't believe that he was hearing the unmistakable sound of someone chopping down one of his trees. He straightened, listening for the strike of the axe. Only silence greeted him. Perhaps it was his imagination? In any case, he pulled protective cloth over the partially assembled, aged pages. Thump, thump, thump. This time he knew his mind wasn't playing tricks. Someone was chopping down a Christmas tree. But who? The workers had left hours ago. The mill workers wouldn't be here until after the holidays, when they'd cut down the crop of trees. Who would have the audacity? Vincent shoved into his coat. Before he headed out, he reached for his scarf and wrapped it around his neck, high enough to cover his left cheek. When he came upon his thief, he stopped in his tracks. It was a woman. Even in her winter coat, Vincent knew that a grown woman was beneath all those layers. She wore a pink parka with a white fur hood, white gloves, and white snow boots. She looked like a snow angel. She might be female and small, but the angel knew how to wield an axe. She lifted the weapon over her shoulder. The parka puffed as she inhaled deep into her chest. On exhale, she struck firm and true. Vincent couldn't take his eyes off her. She had put a good dent in the tree, a good dent in his tree that was meant for the paper mill. That brought him back to his senses. "Hey!" he growled. But his mouth was covered by the scarf and his voice was drowned in the next thunk of her weapon. The snow angel hefted the axe over her shoulder again, but Vincent was on her. He grabbed the handle and snatched it away from her before she could strike another blow. Startled green eyes, like new leaves at the start of fall, sucked the anger from him. Her cheeks were pink from exertion. Her lips were shiny with gloss. He knew it was gloss and not perspiration, because he caught a whiff of the cherry scent. "Hey!" she shouted at him. "What do you think you're doing?" What did she think he was doing? "You never grab an axe from someone," she said. "Not unless you want to lose a limb or a chunk of flesh. What you just did was very dangerous." Vincent questioned his superb hearing again. Was she lecturing him? "What's dangerous is stealing a man's trees." "I'm not stealing," she insisted. Her white hood fell back to reveal sunny blonde tresses. Vincent took a second to gather his wits. He was blinded by the gold against the white snow. His mind had trouble forming an argument, so he reached for book knowledge instead. "Steal, a noun, meaning to take without permission or legal right, without the intention of returning." "You're only half right. I was taking a tree without the intention of returning it." She'd said a complete sentence, but she left it dangling as though she wasn't finished making her point. She cocked her head and glared at him, as though expecting him to complete her thought. When he didn't, she huffed and went on. "Because it's a Christmas tree, you can't put them back into the ground after New Year's, so by definition you can't return it." Just his luck. All the beautiful ones were crazy. Not that he was on the market. He was firmly on the shelf. No woman would want a man scarred on the inside and out. Still, his head was whirling by participating in this conversation. What were they talking about? He needed to concentrate on the words coming out of her mouth, not the way her lips moved as they formed the words. "But I do have permission," she said. "Mr. Klause said I could come over and take whatever tree I wanted, since he's taking my aunt on a cruise." It took Vincent a moment to parse out her words. Then he realized who she was. His uncle had begun dating Beatrice Snow. Beatrice had been coming to the farm for years. Vincent had always liked her. She never told him to put his books down. She'd sit milk and cookies next to him and not try to engage him in conversation. When he was younger, Beatrice had brought her niece around. That little girl had not had the same quiet manner as her aunt. She'd been a blonde tornado, reading out loud, leaving books on the floor, stacking paperbacks high into a tower and watching them fall. And worse, he remembered her taste in books. The Babysitter's Club, Sweet Valley High, Nancy Drew. Vincent wanted to gag just thinking about the mass market books. He had no patience for a woman, or a man for that matter, who didn't read the classics. So this was her, all grown up. What was her name? Lisa? Elizabeth? Something like that. "My uncle sold me the farm," said Vincent. "I've sold it to a paper mill. They now own all the trees, including this one." He pointed to the tree whose outer bark had been lacerated. She'd put a good dent in it. The tree wouldn't survive for the mill. "You sold the Christmas tree farm?" Her voice was incredulous, accusatory. "You sold Christmas?" More memories flooded back to Vincent about this girl. Not only did she shop in the supermarket aisle for books, but she also was a holiday fanatic. He seemed to remember a particularly awful Christmas sweater that lit up. "Look, Lizzie." "It's Izzy." Too bad. Lizzie Bennet was his favorite heroine. His good opinion was now lost forever. "Regardless of what my uncle said," he continued, "you can't have this tree. It's staying put right here." Before she could argue, there was a creaking sound. Vincent looked up just in time to see the tree careening right for him. He had just enough time to push Izzy out of the way before the tree fell on top of him. Chapter 4. Izzy spit out the cold fluff in her mouth. Most of the snow had already melted on her tongue. She'd forgotten the sweet taste of snow while she'd been living out west and down south. There was nothing like falling face first into fresh snow. She turned over to see a storm moving across the sky as the snow fell. Thunder snow was an uncommon occurrence here in Holly, but it had happened before. It had happened the night she'd been born. The same night lightning had struck the clock tower when she'd entered the world. She'd come into the world with thunder lighting the sky and snow pelting the windows. It was probably why she loved the snowfall so much. It signaled that she had arrived. But she had been on her feet a moment ago. Why was she on the ground now? A groan sounded beside her. Someone was in pain. Izzy sat up, and it all came back to her. The falling tree. Nick's nephew. Then everything had gone green. She looked over to find him under the 5-foot tree. Vincent, that was his name. Vincent Klause was taller and broader than the fir, but the tree had taken him by surprise. Izzy rolled the arbor off his body. His hat slipped off his head to reveal dark, curling locks of hair. His scarf, which had covered his mouth as he talked, slipped down to reveal that a downy black beard covered his cheeks and chin. If Nick was the physical embodiment of Santa, his nephew could have easily passed for Santa's younger, hotter heir. Vincent had the same large, healthy build as his uncle. Both men were built like bears, strong and powerful, not roly and jolly. Vincent had certainly resembled a bear when he'd come upon her, growling and snarling. But now, with his body prone and his eyes closed, he looked soft, cuddly. It had been a long time since Izzy had been inside the warmth of a man's embrace. So long that she contemplated laying her head right in the center of Vincent's chest. But that would be wrong. He was injured. She should probably see to his body, or rather, his injuries. Yes, figuring out where it hurt was the order of the day. It was likely his chest, since that's where the tree had landed on his body. With that said, should she remove his coat? And maybe his shirt? Vincent's eyes opened to reveal a blue so vibrant they were almost turquoise. As a December baby, turquoise was Izzy's birthstone. It was also regarded as a love stone. Instead of sparkling, the gems of Vincent's eyes narrowed and hardened. Shall we add attempted murder to your rap sheet now? His hand went to his head. It wasn't just his chest that had been impacted. There was a growing knot on his forehead. Luckily there was no blood, but he still might have a concussion. What were the rules of head injuries? She'd learned them back in middle school when she'd played recreational soccer. She couldn't remember. It had been a long time since she'd kicked or headed the ball. One thing she knew for sure was that she had to get them both inside and out of the rapid snowfall and darkening sky. "Come on," she said. "Ups-a-daisy." "Ups-a-daisy? What are you, 7? Vincent sat up and immediately wobbled. Izzy put her arms around him. Not that she could do much if he fell back down. He'd likely take her with him, which didn't sound like such a bad idea. "Take it easy there, Vinny." He yanked his hand from his head and glared at her. It would have been a very menacing glare if his eyes were focused. "That's not my name." "Well, mine isn't Elizabeth. Now we're both unhappy. Let's get you inside." "I can walk." He wobbled as he stood. Izzy kept her arms around him to keep him from falling, not because she liked the hard feel of his muscles beneath his layers. Not because he smelled of the earthy scent of wood mixed with the prickly green scent of pine. The first smell brought her memories of being in back rooms of libraries where she looked for books to digitize. The second smell brought her back, well, here, to this tree farm. Her second favorite place in the world. The house was too far for him to walk on his fawn's legs. The old barn that Nick had turned into Santa's workshop each year was much closer. Izzy guided them there. Vincent didn't argue. He didn't quite lean into her for support, but he did close his eyes and let her guide him. When she opened the door, she didn't see any of the decorations that had once made the old shack into a magical elf's shop. Half-finished toys and discarded Christmas decorations were shoved to the side. In the center of the room, there was a wooden workbench, an assortment of torture devices hung neatly on the walls. "Close the door," Vincent demanded. "They can't take too much of the elements." "They?" Izzy didn't ask or argue. Perhaps there were pets in here she couldn't see. She refused to let her overactive imagination believe that there might be people trapped in here. She remembered that Vincent was a quiet kid that kept his nose in books. But he hadn't been mean or violent, just preoccupied with whatever story he was reading. In any case, she did as he asked and shut the door behind them. When she turned, he was standing over one of the tables, peeking under a cloth. From her vantage point, Izzy could see that a book lay in pieces beneath the cloth. "Who would do such a thing?" she asked. "Rip a book to shreds like that?" Vincent snapped the cloth tight, covering the murder scene laying beneath it. "Look, as I said before, these trees aren't for sale, but seeing as you butchered one and used it for attempted murder, I suppose you can take it and go." "I'm not leaving you." She held his blue gaze. It was as though green earth met azure sky and crashed. Neither was willing to give way. "You very likely have a concussion," she said. "You can't be left alone." "I do not have a concussion," he said. "You blacked out for a second back there." "Because you hit me with a tree." "Do you have a headache?" "Less from the tree, and more because you won't stop talking." "Your balance is off," Izzy pointed out. Vincent had been leaning on the table. He straightened at her words, only to wobble for a split second, but she caught it. "And you're very irritable," she said. "It's likely due to present company." Izzy remembered now. He had always been an irritable kid. Not just any time she'd poke her head over his shoulder and ask what he was reading. Not just when she put her hand over his book and asked him to come out and play. As an adolescent, he'd glare down his nose at her, just like he was doing right now. But she'd liked his glare back then. She'd liked his growl as a young girl, because the few times that she had been able to tear Vincent away from his book, they'd had the best time. He leaned over the table, tugging at the cloth as a father would tuck a babe into bed for the night. He hadn't hurt that book. He was trying to fix it. It looked like all these years later, Vincent Klause, ardent bibliophile, was still working with books. Would he get a kick out of knowing that she worked in the book industry too? Not on a restoration, like she gathered he was in the business of. More like conservation. Izzy had begun her career working with new e-books. Now she had her sights on digitizing books for archival. Now wasn't the time to talk shop. First thing was first. She went to the cupboard and got the first aid kit. She knew where it was, having gotten many cuts and nicks on this farm while chopping down trees. She retrieved the tin box and came to the table. Vincent glared at her. "I don't need first aid. I'm fine." She reached up and lightly brushed the impressive bump on his forehead. Vincent winced, jerking from her touch. "It's nothing," he said, turning his face away from her so that she was confronted with the right side. "I've been hit by stronger stuff than a tree and survived." She didn't doubt it. She'd heard that he'd gone into the military at some point. That's probably where he'd gotten all those muscles. Izzy pushed thoughts of his muscles aside and set to work. Since her memory failed her for concussion protocol, she reached into her bag for her phone. "What are you doing?" asked Vincent. "Googling how to treat a bump on the head." Vincent let out a heaving sigh. "You have got to be kidding me." Chapter 5. Google it? She was Googling it? Of all the confounded... Vincent pulled on his training from his time in the armed forces as he glared at this invader. His drill sergeant, Sergeant Ross, had been a mean lion of a man. He cracked Vincent into shape in no time. Before the drill sergeant had gotten his hands on him, Vincent had been a slouched-shouldered, hunched-necked young man who always kept his eyes down. It was all due to his habit of reading for the majority of his waking hours. Sergeant Ross had straightened Vincent up and made him stand and walk tall. Vincent stood and walked tall now. There wasn't a wobble in sight as he ushered the intruder out of his workshop where his precious treasure, a bounty worth fighting for, lay protected on the table. He pulled the workshop door behind him and started for the house. But it wasn't without fierce protests from the enemy. "They say you shouldn't move a patient from the scene of the accident." Vincent wanted to argue with her logic. He wasn't a patient. It hadn't been an accident. She'd chopped the tree down on purpose. If she insisted on tending to the tiny bump on his head, he'd allow it, just not anywhere near Morris's memoir. She'd just Googled how to tend to a bump on the head, for goodness sake. Who knew what havoc Isabella Snow would wreak in the confines of those four walls? No, if she wanted to play nursemaid, it would be in the house. And yes, he remembered her full name now. He'd never used the buzzing nickname that others had called her. Why would anyone truncate such a beautiful name as Isabella for a droning one of Izzy? Nicknames and abbreviations were juvenile. He never used them. He called a thing by its given name. Looking at the girl now, Vincent saw nothing juvenile about Isabella. She'd sprung up from the scrawny blonde tornado to become, well, she was still a blonde tornado, but now she'd filled out in all the right places. Perhaps tsunami would be the better term for her. She certainly was a great wave that arrived out of nowhere and wreaked havoc. Vincent opened the door and allowed Isabella to precede him. She pinched her lips as she regarded him, her gaze high and mighty. Vincent had made sure to give her his good right side. Not that he cared what she thought of the scars on the left side of his face. She'd caused a new bruise on his forehead. Her gaze was trained on that. The door closed behind him after she crossed the threshold. The snick of the lock startled him. He had no conscious memory of locking the house door. There was no need to do that. No one else was coming to visit. No one else intended to steal a tree from him. Just her. Vincent stepped away from the door without freeing the lock. He did free his coat and hung it on the hook beside Isabella's discarded coat. She was already deep inside the main room of the two-story home. She'd been in his uncle's house many times, probably more than Vincent had. He hadn't visited as much when he'd become a teen, and after he'd joined the army. He hadn't made many changes, except one. Isabella's gaze was wide, and her lips formed a perfect O shape as she looked at the new addition. In his short weeks here, Vincent had installed bookshelves along the entire south wall of the main room. He held still as he watched Isabella take quick steps to his true treasure. He stood face forward, not in profile this time. He looked full on as he watched her features light up as she read the titles. Isabella's hand reached out, ready to tip the top of "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" toward her. Before her fingers touched the spine, she curled them into a ball and turned. "May I?" she asked. It took a moment before Vincent nodded. When she turned back, he took a deep breath. He hadn't realized he'd stopped breathing. Isabella tipped the book carefully, tugging the volume off the shelf. Vincent let out a low exhale when she cradled it in her arms like it was precious. It was an old volume, but not a first edition. He'd found it on his travels one day while he was on leave in Germany. The spine creaked when Isabella opened the cover. "'Twas the Night" wasn't a book he read often, but he remembered it was her favorite. Not that he'd gotten it for that reason. He hadn't thought of Isabella Snow in years. Just a quarter of an hour ago was the first time he'd thought of her since their youth. Now he couldn't take his eyes off her as she thumbed through the pages of the book. "This is my favorite Christmas story," she said. Uncle Nick would read all of the town's kids the story on Christmas Eve. It wasn't Vincent's favorite story, but he remembered watching little Izzy's eyes light up as she listened, her attention rapt. It was the only time she was quiet. She was quiet now as she read. He watched her lips move, forming the words on the page. He watched her fingers brush left to right on the parchment as she read. Isabella rocked side to side on her feet, like the story was a lullaby. She looked up at him then, catching him staring. Vincent looked away. "I'm sorry," she said. "I got carried away. We're still on you." "Me?" Isabella shut the volume and placed it carefully back on the shelf. Before she turned away, she gave it one more caress of her index finger, and then she was on him. "Sit," she commanded in a voice that Sergeant Ross would have approved of. Vincent obeyed. She ran her fingers over the skin on either side of the knot on his forehead. Vincent meant to wince, but he was too enraptured by the feel of her fingers. It had been a long time since someone had touched him with anything resembling tenderness. "The swelling has stopped," she said. "I think it needs just a little ice." "Is that what Mr. Google suggests?" She tossed him a look over her shoulder as she went to the freezer. She returned a moment later with an ice pack. Vincent knew he should take it from her. She didn't know what she was doing. But his hands were lead in his lap as he watched her come for him. He let her press the pack to his injury, anticipating a jolt of pain as she bumped the bruise. She did it carefully. He'd been prepared to remain stoic as if he felt no pain, but he truly didn't as she leaned over him. "So, tell me, Vinny." He winced at those words. "Why are you selling the tree farm? It brings so much joy to everyone in the community." "It might bring everyone joy, but it doesn't bring in money. My uncle has been running this place at a loss for years." Isabella's gaze connected with his. The corners of her eyes turned down. "I didn't know that about the loss." "So, you see, I'm not the Grinch of this story." Her brows lifted back up, along with the corners of her mouth. "That's still debatable." Vincent had taken a seat at the edge of the couch. He'd left plenty of room for her to sit beside him. Instead, she'd plopped down on the coffee table and leaned into him as she held the cold compress to his bruise. Isabella's knee brushed his. It had been an accident. He knew because her gaze was focused on his forehead. He found himself holding still, hoping for another collision. She pursed her lips as she treated him. Her lips parted and she let out a small sigh. Vincent tasted cinnamon on her breath. It had been long since he'd been this close to anyone, especially a woman, especially a beautiful woman who cradled a book like it was precious. And she still hadn't noticed the scar hiding in plain sight beneath his beard. "So," Vincent began and ended. He wasn't sure which direction he wanted to take the conversation. "'Twas the Night' is still your favorite Christmas story?" Isabella grinned, and Vincent's heart did something funny. He raised his fist and scrubbed it over his chest. "It is," she said. "I read it every day starting after Thanksgiving." "Every day? You carry the book around with you?" "The actual book is packed in boxes now, but I have it on my Blaze e-reader." Vincent jerked back as though she'd slapped him. A Blaze e-reader? One of those handheld computers that was destroying the book industry? That was worse than Googling. Chapter 6. Izzy didn't know what just happened. One minute she'd been holding Vincent's head in her hands, tending to his wounds. The next he was glaring at her as though she'd ripped a page from a book. She hadn't. She'd been very careful with his copy of 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. The illustrations on his copy were too beautiful to be real. She hadn't wanted to put it back. But the book hadn't been the most important task at hand. The red bump on his forehead looked far less angry than the grimace on his face. But it was only his frown that was the detraction, and the icy blue glare he leveled at her. Other than that, the man would have easily made the cover of Romance Heartthrob Monthly magazine. Vincent's jaw didn't just look strong. It was strong and chiseled, like all the descriptions she'd read in romance novels on her blaze. The only problem was he kept behaving like some Victorian hero, sweet and charming one minute, and then harsh and prejudiced the next. What had she said to turn him from charming Pemberley Darcy to curmudgeonly Longbourn Darcy? He'd grimaced when she'd Googled how to treat his bump. He'd chilled while she was actually doing it. It wasn't until she'd brought up her blaze that he became all prejudiced again. "I take it you're not part of the digital revolution?" Izzy asked. But she already knew the answer. Her phone hadn't connected to any Wi-Fi server out here. It had taken a second to search out the network provider, and then she'd barely had 2 bars. What modern human being didn't have high-speed internet connection in their home? Probably one who lived in the woods, surrounded by old books. "That infernal device is why bookshops are closing their doors," said Vincent. "That's not entirely true," Izzy said. "Large chains had trouble competing because they didn't change course, much like the Titanic. But small, local bookstores are still up and thriving because they're adapting to the times." "Adapting?" Vincent all but spat. Once neighborhood bookstore shelves were filled with local authors and hard-to-find books. Now they have to sell whatever nonsense is topping the New York Times or USA Today. "Wow, you haven't changed, have you? Still got a bookmark up your—" "Neither have you. Still reading whatever dribble is on the charts, because some idiots say it's popular. Only now you follow the masses on a flat screen instead of paper." "Not everyone is interested in high literature, Vinny." His lips curled and Izzy grinned broader. She knew he hated the nickname, which was exactly why she used it. "At least people are reading more," she said. "Isn't that the point?" "No," he said. "Reading is meant to stretch the mind." "No," she said. "Reading is meant to allow the mind to escape." They sat face to face, but they couldn't be further apart. Izzy turned to his library, using it as Exhibit A. "Those books weigh you down, but I can carry a library of hundreds with me anywhere I go." "Then you miss the experience of the pages turning, the smell of the leather, the sound of the spine bending as you go faster to get to the next part." There was the passion she'd seen in him at such a young age. There was the boy who would relay the fantastical places he'd visited in pages. He'd described them so vividly that Izzy had felt she'd been there in real life. Now the man sprang to his feet and leveled a finger at her. "You are helping to destroy the book industry." "Am not." She came and stood toe-to-toe with him. "I'm trying to save it. I've worked for a digital press for years. I've been in archival, taking books and scanning them to be digitized so that they'll be preserved for all time." "You and I are diametrically opposed." He took a step back, as though she'd taken a branch from one of the trees outside and struck his heart. "What you're preserving is a combination of ones and zeros, not the book." "Readers are going to get the same experience." "Really? Do you get the same experience when you read 'Twas the Night on your device as you did from the book on the shelf?" Izzy's mind went back to the lush illustrations on the page. He had her there. "Well, no, but I still have the memories of the first time." "The physical book gave you the experience." Her head nodded the concession. "Come with me," he said, tucking her to the front door. Chapter 7. The skies had darkened outside. They should probably stay hunkered down in the main house, but Vincent simply had to prove his point. So, inside his workshop, he pulled the cloth from the life and speeches of Alexis Morris. "Oh!" Isabella gasped. It wasn't the same unconfined joy as when she'd flipped through the pages of 'Twas the Night, but it was a touch of wide-eyed wonder. That tiny gasp, that look in her eyes, released every bit of Vincent's indignation and irritation. Instead of wanting to convince her that he was right about digital books, he wanted to impress her with his restoration skills. "There's only one copy of this book in the world," he said. "It's a collection of speeches by one of the country's early politicians." "I've never heard of Alexis Morris." "I didn't say he was a successful politician." She grinned at that. Vincent had to brace his hands on the table. His heart did that funny little flip again. Maybe he did have a concussion. He picked up his blade and slid it between the loss boards to remove the threads. Isabella's grip on his bicep stopped his motions. Her outraged gasp made him turn to her. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "I'm going to restore it," he assured her. "By destroying it?" "I can't rebuild it until I break it down." Her hand was still on his arm. Her 5 fingers squeezing at his muscle were a far more dangerous weapon than the sharp edge in his grip. "But you see," she said, "with my way, there's no destruction. I would simply copy the pages in a way that can't be destroyed. Digital 1s and 0s don't deteriorate. They could be corrupted, but they'd never disintegrate. And then we could share Mr. Morris's words with the entire world, not just one person at a time." Vincent opened his mouth, but he didn't argue. His mind was far too focused on the way her lips moved as she said the words, the way her green eyes brightened like dewy grass in the spring. The heat of that cinnamon that was still on her breath as she spoke to him reasoned with him. He couldn't think of one single argument against why he shouldn't kiss her. "I'm on your side," she said. "We don't have to be enemies. What we do complements each other." Compliment. He should compliment her. But for a man who knew far too many words, he couldn't get a single one to pass his lips. The razor blade slipped from his hold. Somehow his hand came to rest on her elbow, cradling the joint, pulling her closer. Isabella swallowed. Vincent watched the movement of her elegant throat. Neither backed away. His gaze lifted to her lips, then her eyes. It had been a long time, but he remembered what permission from a woman looked like. She was clearly giving him the pass to kiss her, but he hesitated. Luckily, Isabella had always been a pushy female. As a child, whenever she'd come upon him with a book in his hands, she'd poke and badger him until he put it down to play with her. This wasn't child's play. They were at the big table, and she was asking for dessert. Isabella brought her hand to Vincent's cheek. He inhaled as her fingers brushed the scar beneath his beard. She didn't recoil in disgust. She didn't yank her hand away from the butchered skin. Vincent could tell by the tiny crinkle of her eyes that she'd felt the raised skin, but her gaze didn't settle there. Instead, her eyes latched onto his lips. She'd felt his scar, and still she wanted him. His heart kicked against his chest cavity again. Only now, Vincent knew it had nothing to do with neither his head injury or the one on his face. The impending kiss aside, Vincent felt that this woman was stripping down the layers of his soul. Isabella, the pushy woman that she was, gave his head a tug. Vincent came willingly, eagerly. A bell sounded in the air as if letting them both know that it was past time for this. Isabella startled and pulled back from him. She reached in her pocket and pulled out her cell phone. The ringing hadn't been a sign from above. It had been a technological interruption. "I'm sorry," she said. "I have to take this." Vincent was too dazed to answer. However, he wasn't so dazed that he didn't see the name on the caller ID before she hit the talk button. But even the sight of Rainforest Books didn't melt the want from his tongue, the ache in his hands. He still wanted to kiss her. Maybe she was just ordering a package from the Sell Everything mega company. With just a few words into the eavesdropping on the conversation, he knew that was wrong. Isabella turned her back while she took the call. Her tone changed. It was the tone he used to speak to superiors or clients. It was the tone of wanting to be on the inside. Vincent knew it well. It had been the timbre of his voice as he'd shown her his process. He'd wanted her to be on the inside of his world. He'd wanted her to accept him. Isabella wanted Rainforest Books to accept her. This was clearly a job interview, or, from the sounds of it, a job offer. Desire turned to disappointment. It felt like his heart was shrinking in his chest. His head began to ache. Isabella was the first person to look upon him without disgust or pity. She'd held his face in her hands and wanted to bring him closer, and it was all blowing up in his face. There were a lot of yeses in the one-sided conversation that he could hear. She was taking the job. Vincent knew that Rainforest Books was headquartered in Seattle on the other side of the country. When Isabella hung up the phone, it was Vincent this time that turned his back. Once again, he dared to reach for something precious, only to have it blow up in his face. At least this time the scar would be inside, rather than outside where the whole world could see it. "I guess you heard that," she said. "It's none of my business," he said about putting up his tools. "But I want you to know." She rounded him on his left side. He turned his face away, casting his wound into the shadows. "It's a really interesting job. It's in digital archiving." He turned back to her, exposing his full self again. "Why would I find that interesting?" "Don't be a beast, Vincent." But that's what he was, a scarred, gruff beast of a man who preferred the solitude of his den and ancient parchment to real live people and mass-market books. "There's something between us," said Isabella. "Us? We just met." "We've known each other for more than half our lives. There were sparks when we were kids. You feel it kindling now, don't deny it." She was insane. It was likely all those romance novels she read. So why did he like the sound of her words? "If you thought there was something between us too, we could try and make this work," Isabella said. "There's nothing," but he couldn't say the lie. Isabella reached up to touch his face, the left side. He fought the urge to cradle his face into her hands. "Don't," he managed, pulling away from her, but not turning away. "What happened there?" she asked. He didn't pretend to know what she was asking him. "Shrapnel. While I was trying to save an old, crusty book in Afghanistan. Insurgents blew up many of their monuments, so you see my work is very important to me. I've risked my life for words before." "Meaning you're impulsive when it comes to things you care about?" "Me too." She poked him in the chest. "I know it's been less than an hour, but I know I care about you, and you care about me. Admit it." She was poking him with her words, just like when they were kids. He knew she wouldn't relent until she got her way, but this wasn't a game he wanted to play. "I got burned the last time I reached out for something precious," he said. "I can't see how it would work. I think you should go." Vincent walked to the door, determined to turn her away. He pulled open the door, and a gust of wind and sleet rushed in. First the tree, and now the snow. It was as though the very heavens were against him, separating himself from this woman. He was a scarred beast, clinging to the past. She was a ray of sunshine looking towards the future. Wasn't it clear that it wouldn't work? But the path out of the door was blocked by the elements. The first hurdle was the tree she'd chopped down. It lay on the ground under the darkened sky. In the next instance, the sky lit up. Thunder crackled. Lightning struck. The crack shook the ground, bringing Vincent back to his time in the caves of Afghanistan. He turned his body to shield Isabella. With the smell of fire hitting his nose, he lifted her body and rushed to the back door of the house. It wasn't until they reached the house that he put her down. Once they both were safe from the blaze, he turned and saw it. The tree she'd chopped down was what had caught fire. The pines that had sprinkled on the ground and the branches that had broken made a line to the door of the workshop. In just a matter of minutes, the blaze would breach the door of the workshop, taking the priceless manuscript with it. Vincent felt sick at the thought, but only for a second. He'd saved what meant most to him. He turned, needing to feel Isabella in his arms again, but she wasn't there. He looked up to find her heading back to the workshop. Chapter 8. The storm had moved in fast, faster than any Izzy had ever seen before. In the distance, she heard the town's clock tower strike the hour. The timepiece was likely thanking its lucky dials it had missed the lightning strike this go-round. Izzy took one look at the casualty. Her perfect Christmas tree. It was now split in two on the ground. Fire licked up the pine needles and was now blazing on the branches. She didn't have time to mourn the tree. The blaze had spread, and the flames were now creeping up the steps to Vincent's workshed, where he housed his precious, one-of-a-kind book. Without thinking, and without her winter coat, which they'd both left back in the workshop, Izzy threw herself down the stairs and into the storm. Lightning never struck the same place twice, so she felt fairly certain that she was safe, even though lightning seemed to strike around the most important moments in her life, like her birth, and the moment she felt herself falling in love for the first time. "What are you doing?" Vincent growled behind her. "You're not going in there." But she was already running toward the back door. She slipped inside with Vincent hot on her heels. She heard his roar from outside the door. The fire hadn't made its way in. It was licking at the front door. She had time. She could save the book. "Get away from that!" Vincent hollered from the doorway. At that moment, in the dark of night and blazing fire, he looked like an avenging beast, and not the vulnerable man whose face she'd held in her palm just a few minutes ago. His gaze was on the book, and not her. Isabella ignored him. She might not know exactly how to handle the book, but she was certain she was a better caretaker than the flames. She gathered the book's boards and pages in the protective cloth. By now, the fire was licking at the windows. Vincent marched up to her. He scooped her into his arms like she weighed nothing. As he did so, a couple of pages slipped out of her hands. "Wait," she said. "The pages!" He ignored her. He burst out the back door as the fire shattered the glass of the workshop. More pages slipped out of the cloth as Vincent carried her away from the blaze. He didn't stop walking until they were back inside the house. Outside, wood splintered and crackled as the fire claimed the workshop for its own. But she'd done it. She'd saved the book. Most of it. The pages that were lost were likely the first to go in the blaze. "You lost pages from the book," Izzy said lamely. "I don't care about the book," he growled. "I nearly lost you." "But the book, it's priceless, irreplaceable." "So are you." Vincent pulled the bundle from her arms and let it fall to the floor with a thud. He shoved the blanket filled with the priceless pages out of her hands and crushed her to him. Izzy tilted her head back, partly dazed, mostly wanton. His lips were warm, perhaps from the fire. Perhaps that was just his natural temperature. Izzy didn't care. She curled into the toasty warmth of Vincent Klause. Izzy became so lost in the kiss that she began hearing alarms. It wasn't the ringing of her phone. She'd placed that on silent after she'd hung up with Rainforest Books. The alarm was coming from outside. Vincent pulled away from her. His large body turned so that he could see out the window. The fire department's truck was raring up the drive, but it was too late. The workshop was not going to survive. Izzy looked down at the pages on the floor. She reached down to pick up the spine of the book. Vincent watched her movements. "I could look up Alexis Morris online," she said. "Maybe some of his speeches were printed in the newspapers or archives." "Maybe," Vincent said. But his attention was on her face and not the page in her hand. "We could use the digital files and the original version to restore it," said Izzy. "Blend the original with something new?" She nodded. "We could do it together." "I'm all in," he said. But then his brow dipped. "What about Rainforest Books?" "It's digital archiving. I can do it from anywhere in the world, including a restored workshop on a tree farm that makes paper for books." And then a Christmas miracle happened. Vincent Klause, the grumpiest bookworm on the planet, grinned at her. Izzy's heart did somersaults. He didn't say any more words. He didn't need to. When they were younger, his words would send her mind on fantastical adventures. But his smile told her that they would spend a merry life together of their own creation, and she knew exactly what she was getting him for the holidays. Time to bring this beastly bibliophile into the modern time, with a library he could carry in his back pocket. He'd probably growl at her over it, but she had a sneaking suspicion that his bark would be just as delicious as his bite. Did you enjoy this short story? There's many more soldiers in need of rehabilitation for their bodies and hearts that come to find it on the Purple Heart Ranch. Journey with them as their wounds are healed by the power of love in the continuing series of The Brides of Purple Heart Ranch by Shanae Johnson, available wherever ebooks, audiobooks, and print books are sold.